It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Esther George, who I had the opportunity to work with and serve on her board while she was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank. And as a president of the Federal Reserve Bank, she led a workforce of more than 2,000 employees who supported the organization's role in national monetary policy, financial institution supervision, and the provision of payment and financial services to depository institutions and the U.S. Treasury. She joined the Fed in 1982 and served much of her career in the Division of Supervision and Risk Management. She began by becoming a commissioned bank examiner and eventually served for 10 years as the district's chief regulator. In that capacity, she was responsible for the oversight of the district's state-chartered member banks, nearly 1,000 bank and bank financial holding companies, as well as the bank's discount window and risk management functions. She was also a chair of the Federal Reserve System's Community Banking Organization's Management Group and served as the acting director of the Federal Reserve Division of Banking Supervision and Regulation at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C. As president of the Kansas City Fed, she served on the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which is responsible for setting monetary policy for the United States. In addition, she hosted the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, which is an annual gathering of global central bankers, academics, and policymakers held in the 10th District state of Wyoming. After a remarkable 41-year career, Esther recently retired as president of the Federal Reserve Bank. That was when you get to a certain age at the Federal Reserve Bank, it's a mandatory retirement. Otherwise, she'd probably still be serving. She's going to share with us her insights on the state of the economy and other observations germane to the present economic situation. So we're pleased to have her with us here tonight, and I think you'll be fascinated by her insights into the state of our economy. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions, so please take advantage of that. Just fill out one of the cards on your chairs, and we'll pass them to the end of the aisle where they'll be collected. So with that, now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Esther George.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paul. What an honor to be at an event like this, to see the importance of integrity elevated here, and Mick, to see you be recognized for that. Paul, I want to also just recognize you and the Thompson family. You did serve on my board. You brought that integrity with you, which is so important to the work that the Federal Reserve does. And your dad was a special person, for sure. I worked for Byron Thompson before I really knew who he was. I was a teller, a gopher at one of his banks in St. Joe, doing whatever they asked of me. But as I got to know him more later in my career at the Fed, what a tremendous supporter. An example of leadership, and someone that when you offer this award, I can tell you firsthand, it means a lot. And I do want to say, Mick, to you, really, what a well-deserved recognition for someone that I think has done more for this city than many people appreciate. Every day in my office at the Fed, when I would look down at Union Station, I was reminded of how important transportation was to actually having a Federal Reserve Bank located in this city. The organizing committee came around and said, wow, this city looks like it is focused on the future. It is putting together transportation. It's a hub of commerce. And they decided to put it right there. And you certainly have been a leader in your industry, your vision, your long-term thinking, and again, your integrity. So you are someone I want to thank for your support of me, the role model you've been in many ways, and I hope you and Marlis both continue to do well, even as you do good in our community. So again, congratulations. So my comments this evening are going to build in some way on this theme of integrity in finance and economics. And I'll do that from the perspective of a recovering central banker. I have been away from the Kansas City Fed now for a couple of months. I do have to say, things looked okay January 31st. I don't know what happened after I left, but there are many headlines today. In fact, frequent headlines that I think often leave people wondering what is going on, what is happening in the economy, soft landings, hard landings, will there be a landing at some point so we know the outlook? So I want to just put a bit of a wider lens on today's issues, thinking about some of the longer term implications of what's going on in the economy. And I'm going to start with the event that we have now fondly come to know as the pandemic, the global pandemic. It really threw economies around the world a curveball, and it certainly did in the United States. When the attention on public safety, personal safety, took center stage, the idea that we wanted to limit personal interaction out of health concerns for the public really affected our economy in ways that we did not understand, and I think probably today continue to live with and will for some time to come. You saw the federal government transfer some $6 trillion in total from its balance sheet to the balance sheet of households, businesses, state and local governments. And at the same time that money was moving into our economy, you had a Federal Reserve that went aggressively in easing monetary policy, back to zero interest rates, and undertaking quantitative easing at a rate that we had not done anything the likes of during the 2008 and 2009 crisis. So the combination of all of that money coming into the economy at a time when supply constraints were very acute caused there to be these extreme imbalances between demand and supply. And John, you're going to be a terrific economist, philosopher. We could use more philosophy at the Federal Reserve, I would argue. But you know well that when you get a kink between supply and demand, you get one thing, and we are living with that today, and that is high inflation. The high inflation really took the Federal Reserve by surprise, and it is a point today that has challenged the credibility of the Federal Reserve and questions about the integrity of the institution in terms of what was going on, why didn't people see this inflation sooner, and of course what's happening with a very aggressive response to that today. I was in New York last week, and someone said, well, but you had the best of intentions, and you can't criticize people with good intentions. And I immediately thought of a phrase that my dad would often say about good intentions, about paving roads to certain places that get you there. So I will just say, of course, no one had any ill intentions in these actions, but there are consequences, and today we are experiencing some of those consequences with an inflation that is proving to be not transitory, not really temporary at all, but very persistent. And there are some reasons for that. At the same time that the Fed began to recognize this policy miss, it began to move very aggressively. If you think back to just 1 year ago, March of 2022, over the last 12 months, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates some 500 basis points, and it has begun very aggressively reducing its balance sheet as a way to get ahead of inflation expectations setting in, as a way to get ahead of people beginning to think, oh, inflation now, 3 years out, 5 years out, which of course was the policy era of the 1970s, when Paul Volcker had to take some very, very drastic moves to try to change that psychology for people that embedded that. So there are three things I wanted to touch on tonight in terms of how I think this economic outlook might unfold. There are things that I've said over the past year in many respects, and that is, even as we've seen supply chains begin to get better, the combination of very aggressive monetary policy still leaves us with a 5% inflation rate that is well over the 2% that the Federal Reserve has targeted, is nowhere near being considered price stability, which is the Fed's mandate. And there are a couple of things that I look at that I think will continue to keep pressure on that inflation even as the Fed tries to respond. One of those is continued supply constraints, and I'm going to focus on labor markets there. The other is thinking about how much of that monetary stimulus, relief money is still out there and poses the potential for keeping demand strong. And the last thing I'll mention is just looking at fiscal policy today and where we are with trying to understand how much federal debt the United States can manage before it begins to be more costly. So I'll touch on each of those briefly. We have today really an extraordinarily low unemployment rate in the United States, 3.5%. In fact, I would guess that the feedback that we get from businesses in the 10th Federal Reserve District hasn't changed much, where the number one constraint, the number one concern they have is finding people to fill the jobs they have. It's become a big challenge in doing that. And when you have such a very tight labor market, it creates some of these imbalances, and it is really extraordinary to see, after the past year of the Fed's rate increases, that we continue to have a very strong labor market. Still, nearly 2 openings for every person that would be looking for a job. That's an extraordinarily tight labor market. There are a couple of things when you look at that workforce to say what's happened. What happened since 2019? Where did those people go? And here's where I think you see some effects of the pandemic still with us. One of those is people have left the workforce are people age 55 and older. We saw a lot of people retire during the pandemic. People either said, that's it, I'm going to quit. The stock market looked good at the time. There were other ways for them to supplement. They had concerns about health and continuing to work. And so we've really seen an unusually large cohort of people leaving the workforce for retirement. It's interesting because we know we have an aging demographic. What I had not appreciated until we went through this period was how many people that retire that actually come back and take a job of some kind. Maybe not full-time, but they come back to work, and we have not seen the numbers come back to where they were in 2019. So unless something changes in a way that would cause an older cohort of worker to come back to the workforce, that will continue to be a constraint. The other thing that we see in that data is immigration is not supplementing our workforce. So we have an aging demographic in this country that we will need a workforce to be able to come in behind here. If the births in this country aren't going to keep up with it, we historically have looked to immigration to help fill that. And we are down substantially over the last 5 years or so where we were with immigration. So that, of course, will keep the labor market tighter. And the other thing that I find interesting is on the supply side of our economy, childcare has become a constraint. As capacity was taken out in childcare, and this was one of the first areas that we saw in the economy begin to shrink, begin to pull back because of health issues, that industry has not come back. And where it has come back, the cost of childcare has gone up along with inflation, and you find that people are making a decision about, can I afford childcare or do I sit out? There are many other reasons that people aren't coming back into the workforce, and you can go through surveys. They range for people that say, I just don't want to work, to some of these issues that I've talked about. So having a tight labor market is really creating some challenges in our economy right now. And when the Fed pushes hard on its interest rates to reduce demand, it is a way to try to bring that back into balance. When I look out at what might happen with demand, of the money that went out to households, to businesses, to state and local government, we are still sitting on about $1 trillion in excess savings in the economy. And we've watched for some time to say people may become more cautious, and hang on to that would make the Fed's job easier as it raised rates, to see that demand come off and inflation come down. And so far, people are showing a real propensity to continue to spend. And how that next $1 trillion of excess savings begins to unfold, I think, is going to be important. We saw the big shift of people spending less on things. Again, remember during the pandemic when you couldn't travel, you couldn't go out, people began to buy gym equipment, remodel their houses, began to put a lot of demand on manufacturing. Today we see manufacturing slowing. We see some of those sectors of the economy showing signs of inflation slowing, but on the services side of our economy continues to be very sticky and very persistent, because people are traveling, they're going out, they're taking advantage now of being able to do things that they weren't able to do over the past few years. So the question of how much more the Fed will have to do to get that demand with that supply constraint back in order, I think remains to be seen. The last thing I'll mention has to do with fiscal policy, and this is something that I intentionally did not talk about before, because there is an unspoken rule between monetary policymakers and fiscal policymakers, which is you stick to your knitting and we'll stick to ours. And since I'm no longer bound by that rule, I want to just make an observation. It looks like this will be the 20th consecutive year where Congress will not set a budget in a timely way. We are halfway through the year, and we are looking out over the next decade, the debt in the United States exceeding the size of our economy. Already we are seeing interest expense is poised for the next 5 years to exceed some of our largest spending categories like defense and Medicaid. And for the U.S., I think people have generally thought that's not going to be an issue for us. We're the world's reserve currency. We have a lot of flexibility in terms of people demanding our debt. But I've never been quite convinced that that assurance would be long-term if we didn't pay attention to the integrity of how we set our spending relative to our expenditures. And we know in this country, I just got my red, white, and blue card. We have an aging population in the United States. The demands on the services offered are going to continue to grow. And so it will be important, both from a standpoint of interest rate policy, of decisions that have to be made about spending and taxation, that those issues get addressed and that we not leave them for a next generation to have to wrestle with. So the state of the economy is in flux, I would say. The imbalances that emanated from the pandemic have not fully been resolved. I think it will take some time to do that. And I think particularly in focus, we'll be looking at the workforce in the United States. As the Federal Reserve makes decisions about how high it will push interest rates, how long it will hold them there, the job does not get easier, it gets harder. And the reason it gets harder is because to reduce demand means that that labor force is likely to experience more unemployment. If you look at the Federal Reserve's forecast, you will see that by the end of the year, there is an expectation that the unemployment rate will rise. And that, of course, was one of the challenges of the 70s and 80s that caused the Federal Reserve to pull back and not get inflation under control until it was too late. My hope for my colleagues is they will see their way through to tackling that important issue. So Mick, again, congratulations. It is an honor to be here to address this audience, and I look forward to your questions. And any other thoughts you have, feel free to pass them on. Thank you.